The sun hung low in the sky as I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the remote campground. The place was nearly empty. Just a couple of RVs parked near the entrance and a lone tent set up far off near the tree line. That was fine by me. I wanted solitude. I needed a break from the city, from work, from the constant buzz of my phone. A weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect way to reset. I picked a spot near the lake, away from the other campers. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore was oddly calming. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a fire before the sun disappeared completely. By the time I lit the fire, the sky had turned a deep blue, and the stars were beginning to show. I ate a simple meal, just some canned soup heated over the fire, before settling into my chair and letting my mind wander. It was quiet, too quiet. I was used to the hum of traffic, the occasional siren, people talking on the streets below my apartment window. Here, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I told myself it was just small animals, raccoons, maybe a fox, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like something wasn't quite right. I shook it off and let myself relax. After a while, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the entrance. The air was cool, and I drifted off easily, lulled to sleep by the gentle sounds of the lake. A noise woke me up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing, listening as the steps circled my tent once, twice, then stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was an animal and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and immediately noticed something was off. The fire pit looked different, like the ashes had been disturbed. I knew for a fact I had let the fire burn out before going to bed, but now there were fresh, blackened pieces of wood mixed with the cold ash. I looked around, but nothing else seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there while I slept. I spent the day hiking, trying to put the uneasy feeling behind me. The trail was overgrown, winding through dense trees and leading up to a rocky overlook with a view of the entire valley. I stayed there for a while, breathing in the fresh air and reminding myself why I came. It was beautiful, peaceful. I needed this. As the sun started dipping toward the horizon, I made my way back to camp. The feeling of unease crept back the moment I stepped onto the dirt clearing where my tent stood. Something was different. My gear had been moved, not stolen, not ransacked, just moved. My sleeping bag was unrolled in a slightly different position. My backpack, which I was sure I had left zipped up, was open. My food, untouched. Someone had been here. I checked the ground for footprints, but the earth was too dry to hold any. My first thought was that it had to be another camper, maybe a park ranger. But why wouldn't they have woken me up? Why would they go through my things and then leave without taking anything? That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could, throwing on extra wood to keep the flames high. I sat with my back to the tent, scanning the darkness for any movement. The trees stood still, the lake reflecting the light from my fire. Nothing, just my imagination, I told myself. I was overreacting. Still, I barely slept. Every little noise had me jerking awake, heart racing. I kept my flashlight within reach, my knife under my pillow. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a light sleep. But then, in the dead of night, something pulled me from it. The same sound as before, footsteps. This time, I was certain. Slow, careful steps circling my tent again. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Then, something pressed against the fabric of the tent. A hand? A shoulder? I didn't breathe, didn't move. It stayed there for a moment, then slid away, the footsteps retreating into the darkness. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. As soon as the sun was up, I packed up my gear, stuffing everything haphazardly into my backpack. I didn't care about organization. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, I noticed something just beyond the trees, half buried in the leaves. A single boot, old, worn, covered in dirt. Too big for me, too big for most people. My stomach turned. I didn't want to think about what it meant. I didn't run, but I walked fast, taking the trail back to my car without stopping. My heart pounded the whole way. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car exactly where I left it. I tossed my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors the moment they shut. As I pulled out, I glanced at the empty campsite in my rearview mirror. The fire pit, my tent's outline in the dirt, the trees standing silent around it. I told myself I had been paranoid, that maybe there had been another camper I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I was never a fan of camping. I liked the idea of it, the quiet, the fresh air, the simplicity of being away from the world, but the reality never sat right with me. Something about being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness and the unknown, always left me on edge. Still, my friends had convinced me to go. "It'll be fun," they said. "You'll love it." We picked a spot deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. The kind of place where the road eventually turns to dirt, then to nothing. No cell service, no lights, just trees and the sound of whatever lived in them. It was late summer, still warm during the day but cool at night, the air carrying that crisp edge that warned of fall creeping in. By the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set. We rushed to get our tents up, working fast as the light faded. There were 5 of us, each with our own tent, arranged in a loose circle around the fire pit. The fire crackled to life, throwing long shadows across the ground, making the trees seem even taller, even closer. We ate, we drank, we laughed, and when the fire burned low, we crawled into our tents and let the night swallow us. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest orange glow. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects, the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Normal things, but something felt off. Then I heard it, a sound just beyond the reach of the dying fire. A rustling, slow and deliberate, not the frantic scurrying of a small animal. Something moving, something big. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Heavy steps, the crack of a branch underfoot. A bear. It had to be a bear. I swallowed hard, trying to remember what you're supposed to do in this situation. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Don't run. My mind raced through every piece of advice I'd ever heard about dealing with bears, but I had no idea if any of it would actually help. Then the sound stopped. Silence. The kind that presses against your ears, makes you aware of your own breathing. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the fire had played tricks on my half-asleep mind. Then something touched my tent. A slow, dragging movement, something trailing along the fabric. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't a bear. A bear wouldn't do that. A bear would sniff, maybe paw at it. But this was careful, deliberate. I stayed frozen, my mind screaming at me to do something. Anything. But what? Call out? Hope it was one of my friends messing with me? No one had said a word. No laughter, no whispers, nothing to suggest a prank. And if it wasn't them, the sound moved to the zipper of my tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands gripped my sleeping bag, as if that would somehow protect me. The zipper didn't move, but I could hear breathing. Low, steady, just on the other side of the thin fabric. Too steady, not animal-like at all. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The steps retreated, moving away from my tent, back into the darkness. I lay there, too afraid to move, barely daring to breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won, and at some point, I drifted back to sleep. Morning came like a slap to the face. Sunlight streamed through the thin fabric of my tent, and for a brief, blissful moment, I thought maybe it had all been a dream. Then I stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. The dirt around my tent, once smooth, was covered in footprints. Human footprints. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friends were up, looking at the ground, at each other, at the trees. No one spoke at first. We didn't need to. The prints circled our tents, weaving between them, stopping just at the entrances. No bear, no animal. Person. A person had been out there, walking among us while we slept. We packed up fast. No one argued, no one lingered. The fun was gone, replaced with a thick, unspoken fear. We left that place behind, drove until we found cell service, and then drove even further. No one ever talked about it again. But I know we all think about it, especially at night when the house is dark and the world is quiet, and you start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone is standing just outside your window listening to you breathe. I had gone out alone. I needed some time away from everything, work, my phone, people. Just a few days in the woods, breathing fresh air, hearing nothing but wind through the trees and the occasional sound of running water. I picked a spot about an hour and a half from town, near a lake I had read about. It was supposed to be quiet, not a lot of traffic, which was exactly what I wanted. The kind of place where you don't run into many other people. I got there late in the afternoon, parked at the trailhead, and hiked about 3 miles in. The trail was overgrown in some spots, like it hadn't been used much. That was fine by me. It was nice, actually, knowing I wouldn't have to deal with noisy hikers or people playing music too loud at their campsites. I found a good spot by the lake, cleared out a small area, and set up my tent. The place was beautiful. The water was calm, barely a ripple on the surface. The trees were thick, towering pines and oaks, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat there just listening. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I didn't sleep well that first night. I kept waking up, feeling like something was off. It wasn't noises or anything. I've camped enough to know the sounds of the woods at night. This was something else. A feeling, like I wasn't alone. But every time I poked my head out of the tent, all I saw was darkness. Just the trees, my fire dying down to embers, and the quiet, still lake beyond. The next morning, I shook it off. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me, not being used to the silence after months of city noise. I made breakfast, drank my coffee, and spent the day fishing and hiking. It was nice, except for that nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't quite go away. That night, it got worse. I woke up again around 2 in the morning, heart pounding. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. Something moving outside my tent. Not an animal. The sound was too careful, too deliberate. Slow footsteps, one after the other, crunching softly against the dirt and dry leaves. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. The steps circled my tent, moving through the trees just beyond where I could see. I wanted to believe it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. Someone was out there. I waited, gripping my knife, listening as the steps faded away into the woods. It was another hour before I finally let myself breathe normally again. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. If someone had been out there, they were probably just another camper who happened to pass by. The woods weren't completely empty after all. I told myself I was overreacting. I had come out here to be alone, and that's exactly what I was. Alone. That night, it happened again. The steps came back, moving slower this time, closer. I held my breath, knife in hand, listening as whoever or whatever. It was stopped just outside my tent. I could hear them breathing. Not an animal, not the wind. Person. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited, heart hammering, until finally, the steps started again, moving away, back into the trees. I waited until the first light of morning before I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, not hiking shoes. Bare feet. They circled my tent, stopped at the entrance, then disappeared into the trees. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about the peaceful lake or the beautiful trees. I just wanted to be out of there. I hiked back to my car, checking over my shoulder the entire way, feeling like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I moved fast, practically running by the time I saw my car at the trailhead. But the worst part? When I got to my car, there was something on the hood. A single muddy handprint. Too big to be a child's, too small to be a man's. Smudged, like someone had pressed their hand there and then dragged it down slowly. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I was back in town. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I do know one thing. I won't ever camp alone again. I should have never gone camping alone. It wasn't the first time, and I had always thought of myself as experienced. I knew how to read a map, how to set up camp properly, how to store food so animals wouldn't get to it. I had done it all before, but this time was different. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from everything, away from people, from work, from the noise of everyday life. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual camping sites. I wanted solitude, just me and nature. I drove for hours to get there, then hiked another 5 miles into the forest. The first day went well. The air was cool, the leaves crunched under my boots, and the sound of birds and rustling trees made everything feel peaceful. I found a good spot near a small stream, set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, I sat by the fire and let my mind wander. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Probably just a deer. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It was subtle, like something brushing against the fabric. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Not an animal. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things and fell back asleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my tent. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't animal tracks either. Bare feet. Human. The prints circled my campsite, stopping right outside my tent. My stomach tightened. I tried to shake it off. Maybe another hiker had wandered through. Maybe they were just curious and left when they saw my tent. It was unsettling, but I wasn't going to pack up and leave over some footprints. I spent the day fishing and exploring the area. I tried to enjoy myself, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for anything unusual. The woods felt different now, quieter, like something was watching. That night, I made sure my fire was big. The warmth and light made me feel safer. I ate quickly and crawled into my tent, keeping my flashlight within reach. Sleep came in restless waves. Every little sound made me jolt awake, heart racing. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing, right outside my tent. Slow, steady breathing. I froze. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't move. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, the sound of fabric moving. My tent zipper. I shot up, grabbing my flashlight and flicking it on. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. My tent was still zipped. My hands were shaking as I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The fire was still burning, casting shadows through the trees. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. I barely slept after that. I stayed inside my tent, gripping my knife, waiting for the first hint of daylight. As soon as the sun started rising, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up fast, throwing everything into my bag without care. The uneasy feeling hadn't left. If anything, it was worse. I felt exposed, vulnerable. As I shouldered my pack and started heading back to my car, I noticed something on the ground where my tent had been. A single, dirty handprint, larger than mine. I moved faster. I didn't care about the weight of my pack or the aching in my legs. I needed to get out. I needed to be somewhere safe. The entire hike back, I felt eyes on me. Every so often, I stopped and listened. The forest was silent, too silent. Then, maybe a mile from my car, I heard it again. Footsteps. Behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was paranoia. Then, to my left, something moved. A man. He was standing maybe 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his skin was covered in dirt. His hair was long, matted. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the noise I was making. I didn't care if I tripped and fell. I just ran. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. When I finally saw my car, I nearly cried. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking, and practically threw myself inside, locking the doors immediately. My eyes darted to the trees, expecting to see him standing there. But he wasn't. I started the engine and sped out of there, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I drove until I reached the nearest town, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling. I never went back for the gear I left behind. I never went camping alone again. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he had been out there, watching me. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need to put it somewhere to get it out of my head. Maybe if I see it written down, it'll make more sense. But I don't think it ever will. All I know is that I'm never going back to that place. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, some fresh air, and a few days away from everything. I picked a spot far from any established campgrounds, deep in a national forest where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I wanted the quiet, the solitude. I'd camped alone before plenty of times, but this time felt different, even before I left. I ignored the feeling. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some food, a water filter, my knife, a small hatchet, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. The essentials. I parked my truck at a small, unmarked trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was barely visible, just an old game trail, really, but I had a map and compass. I wasn't worried. I hiked most of the day before settling on a spot near a small creek. The water was clear, running steady, and the ground was soft enough for my tent. I set up camp as the sun dipped low, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the night came, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. I don't know when I first noticed it, but at some point, I realized the forest had gone silent. No wind, no insects, no animals. Just stillness, the kind that presses in around you. I sat by the fire, listening, my stomach twisting. Then, in the distance, I heard it. A single snap of a branch. Not the soft crackle of a small animal, but something heavier, deliberate. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably a deer, maybe a bear. I turned in for the night, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something outside. Every time I shined my flashlight through the tent, there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself it was just first night jitters. I had 2 more nights planned. That day, I explored the area. I kept my knife on my belt, my hatchet strapped to my pack. I wasn't scared, not really, but I felt uneasy. I found an old, collapsed cabin a little ways from my camp. Just a pile of rotting wood, really, but something about it made me pause. The trees around it were different, thicker, their trunks twisted. I didn't stay long. That night, it happened again. The silence, the weight of it, then the sound. Closer this time, footsteps, not the uneven crashing of an animal, but steady, deliberate steps. I stayed inside my tent, my knife clutched in my hand, barely breathing. The steps circled my tent once, twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep. By morning, I was done. I packed up, ready to leave. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them, footprints. Human footprints circling my tent in the dirt. Bare feet. No shoes, no socks. Just prints deep in the soil. I stood there for a long time, staring. Then I grabbed my gear and left. The hike back felt different. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. I moved fast, barely stopping. But as I walked, I saw something ahead on the trail. A shape, person, just standing there, not moving. Too far to see details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I just kept walking, gripping my knife, my pulse hammering in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. But as I passed where they had been, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I don't remember the rest of the hike. I just remember reaching my truck, throwing my gear inside, and locking the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. Then I started the engine and left. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know I'm never going back. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, miles from anyone, listen. If the forest goes silent, if you hear footsteps that aren't yours, leave. Don't wait. Don't question it. Just go. I don't know why I agreed to go camping that weekend. Maybe I wanted a break from everything, work, the city, the noise. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I could still handle being alone in the woods. I'd done it before, plenty of times when I was younger, but the older I got, the less I trusted the quiet. The drive out to the forest took longer than I remembered. The road stretched on forever, winding through empty fields and past old farmhouses with peeling paint. The gas station I stopped at felt like something out of another time, the kind of place with flickering lights and a single bored attendant who barely looked up when I paid for gas. I should have taken it as a sign. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was sinking low. The plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near the lake, spend a couple of nights away from everything, then hike back out. I had everything I needed: tent, food, water, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife, just in case. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The trail started off easy. Birds chirped in the trees, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. But the deeper I went, the quieter it got. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being alone like this anymore. Still, I checked over my shoulder more than once. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing near the lake, just like I planned. The water was still, reflecting the last bits of sunlight like a sheet of glass. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going before eating a quick meal. Everything seemed fine, but that feeling didn't go away. As darkness settled in, the forest changed. The sounds were different. No birds, no wind, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out in the trees. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush, but I didn't like how close it sounded. I stayed up longer than I meant to, staring into the fire, listening. My mind kept playing tricks on me, making me think I saw movement in the shadows. I kept gripping my knife without realizing it. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I forced myself to crawl into the tent. The fire had burned low, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I told myself to relax, that I was safe. But when I finally started drifting off, something woke me. A sound. Soft. Close. At first, I thought it was just an animal again. Maybe a raccoon rummaging through my stuff. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step. Not an animal. Not some clumsy, stumbling movement through the underbrush. This was something careful, cautious, human. I held my breath, heart hammering. The sound stopped, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I started to convince myself it was my imagination, I heard something even worse. Breathing. Not my own. Not far away. Right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. I wanted to believe it was some trick of the wind, but I knew better. Someone was out there, standing just beyond the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the dark. Then, without warning, the tent shifted. Something or someone pressed against it just slightly, just enough to let me know they were there. I snapped into action, sitting up and slashing at the tent wall with my knife, tearing the fabric. The second I did, I heard footsteps, fast, heavy, running back into the trees. I scrambled out, still clutching the knife, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees, the empty woods stretching on forever. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every little sound. By morning, I had convinced myself to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to stick around and find out who had been out there. The hike back was worse. Every step felt like I was being followed, like someone was just behind me, staying out of sight. I moved fast, almost running by the time I reached my truck. When I finally locked the doors, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I never saw who or what was out there. I don't know if they were just messing with me or if it was something worse, but I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I always loved the idea of camping, being out in the open, away from the noise of life, the stress, the routine. It always felt like an escape. But sometimes, being out in the middle of nowhere isn't as peaceful as it seems. Sometimes the quiet is the worst part. A few years ago, I went camping alone for the first time. I had done plenty of group trips before, but I wanted to try something different. I wanted the challenge, the solitude, the sense of survival. It felt like the kind of experience I needed. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campsites. I didn't want to hear other campers or see anyone else's fire flickering through the trees. I drove down an old logging road for miles until I found a clearing near a creek. It was perfect, flat ground, a good source of water, and plenty of wood for a fire. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The sun was setting, and everything felt just right. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But as the last bit of daylight faded, I started feeling something else. Something subtle, but unsettling. It was too quiet. I hadn't noticed before, but there were no sounds of insects, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I brushed it off. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention before. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get to me. I told myself that over and over as I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I slept lightly, waking up to the smallest sounds. A snapping twig, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional gust of wind that made the trees creak. Every time I woke up, I listened, heart pounding, waiting for something more. But nothing came. Sometime past midnight, I woke up again, this time for no reason at all. My eyes opened, and I was just aware. Something felt off. I listened carefully. Nothing, just silence. Then, from somewhere in the trees, I heard something new. A low, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, like something knocking against a tree. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more taps. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, waiting for some animal to scurry away and prove to me that it was nothing. But it didn't stop. It just kept going. I told myself it was a branch in the wind, a woodpecker, something harmless. But it didn't sound like that. It was too steady, too deliberate. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound to stop. I thought about getting out of my tent, shining my flashlight into the woods, but something deep in my gut told me not to. Eventually, the tapping faded, and exhaustion pulled me into sleep. Morning came, and with it, relief. The forest felt normal again. Birds were chirping, the creek was flowing, the world was alive. I shook off the uneasy feeling from the night before, convincing myself I had imagined it. I spent the day exploring, gathering firewood, enjoying the solitude. I even laughed at myself a little for being so jumpy. But as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I built my fire bigger, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat up late, staring into the trees, listening. But nothing happened.
No tapping. No strange noises.
Just the wind and the distant calls of night animals. I felt myself relax, thinking maybe the worst of my nerves were over. Maybe tonight I would actually sleep. But then I saw it. Just beyond the glow of my fire, deeper in the trees, there was movement. A shape just barely visible between the trunks. It was low to the ground, moving slowly. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe a bear. But as I watched, I realized it was crawling. It moved in short, jerky motions, almost like it was dragging itself forward. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was an animal, some wounded creature struggling to move, but something about it wasn't right. The way it stayed just at the edge of the light, just where I couldn't see it clearly. Then it stopped. It didn't run. It didn't back away. It just stopped moving and sat there, watching. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, and pointed it toward the trees. The moment the beam hit that spot, it was gone. No movement, no sound, just empty woods. I stayed up all night, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness. I didn't hear the tapping that night, but I felt something far worse. something watching me. I could feel it just beyond the firelight, just out of reach. When dawn finally came, I packed up as fast as I could. I doused my fire, loaded my gear, and started the long walk back to my truck. My heart pounded the whole way. Every rustle, every crunch of leaves, I was convinced it was right behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and climbed in, locking the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, waiting for my pulse to slow. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing. But as I put my keys in the ignition, I glanced up at the tree line. Something was standing there, not crawling, not hiding, standing. I didn't wait to get a better look. I started the truck, slammed it into drive, and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by other cars, other people, civilization. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing for sure. I will never go camping alone again.